Greetings, everybody. I'm sorry that we cannot be uh, gathered in Seoul for this very important anniversary of Gwangju democratic uprisings that usher in a new era of democratic struggle and eventually, thoroughly democratized Republic of Korea, its society, and its political system. Um, my name is Zani, and I was born and raised in Burma up until I was about 24. And I belong to the generation popularly known among the political dissidents and Burmese citizens as 88 generation. The term 88 generation came from the uprisings that ended the one party military rule led by General Ne Win. The uprising began in 1987 fall, continue well into 1988, August and September. The uprising was initially primarily led by students, both university and pre-university students across the country, and particularly in major cities such as Rangoon, Mandalay, and other places. Now, I belong to that generation. At the time, I was only 24. Before the nationwide uprising erupted in August of 1988, I left Burma for California to do my graduate studies at the University of California at Davis campus. And since then, I've been exiled on and off twice, and now permanently exiled in UK because of my continued opposition to the Burmese military rule, and more ominously, the genocidal policies of Myanmar or Burma as a whole towards the most vulnerable segment of our society, known as the Rohingya, or the predominantly Rohingya Muslims. Last August, I was in Seoul, organized for a conference organized by my Korean, activist friends and organizers, particularly Kinam Kim of the Korean Civil Society for Rohingya. The Kinam and his colleagues, in collaboration with us in the Free Rohingya Coalition around the world, co-organized and hosted the international conference on the ongoing genocide of Rohingyas in Burma, and attempt to debate, discuss, and explore various international and regional mechanisms to establish accountability and redress for the Rohingya, the plight of the Rohingya. So after the conference, Kinam and I went to pay homage to Gwangju National Cemetery, or where the hundreds, I think like 500 or so, brave Korean citizens rose up against the one-party military rule of, I believe, at the time, President Chun or General Chun Do-won. And I was very moved and inspired by what the Korean civil society activists in Gwangju and South Korea at large had accomplished throughout the last 40 years. So this anniversary, the 40th anniversary of May 18 uprising that began in Gwangju, is extremely important, not just for the Korean people in the Republic of Korea, but for for people around the world, and particularly for other Asians in Far East and Southeast Asia, which include Burma, my own country, that continue to struggle for self-governance, the basic human rights, um, you know, and a democratic or representative form of government. As after Guangzhou uprising, the Filipino civil society, working together with the Catholic Church and others within the old Marcos regime, successfully toppled Marcos dictatorship in 1986. That's 6 years after Guangzhou uprisings. And then 2 years after the Filipino People Power movement, we, the Burmese students and others in society at large in Burma, revolted against similarly atrocious military dictatorship led by General Ne Win. So I'm very pleased and honored to be asked to share my perspective, that is termed a transnational perspective on the Burmese democracy movement that made world headlines in 1988. But I want to talk about three things. One is the ideological underpinnings of our democratic struggle, and I would say democratic struggles around the world, irrespective of the geographic location or the civilizational background of any society in revolt. The first point I want to share is this ideological background that democracy is alien to Asians and other non-European civilizations and cultures. As you know, we in Southeast Asia have been fed this lie from the leaders of Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, that we have our own quote-unquote Asian values and democracy is alien and therefore not suitable as a form of governance for nearly 600 million people across Southeast Asia. Well, last year in February, we were privileged to have received the videotaped remark from Professor Noam Chomsky, renowned linguist and activist, promoting the idea of democratic citizenry around the world, not only in the U.S. And Professor Chomsky put it rather accurately that elites in Western civilization that likes to promote itself as liberal and democratic have without fail throughout the recorded history of the what we would call today the West, attempt to crush or thwart any popular demand for participation in running of political states, nation states, and the various policies of any political system. And so when we say democratic struggle or democracy, although the word was coined by the Greek, we must realize that democracy is not exclusive, or democratic values are not exclusive possession or property of any civilization, East or West or anything in between. So, in our country, the idea of people self-governing did not come about until 1920s and 1930s, when radical socialist and progressive ideas begin to spread across English-speaking Burmese university students and other in the other local elites that came to be exposed to socialism, Marxism, and other types of humanist egalitarian ideologies. And up until that point, the Burmese society was feudal, and the society and the people were infested with the ideal, aversion of the divine king, one person, one family having the divine right to rule, and the idea of people as citizens having a say and as the source of sovereignty and power did not come about until 1920s and 30s. And in after independence from Britain, the Burmese nationalist leaders of that generation in late 1940s and 50s adopted a type of parliamentary democracy. And because of the extremely rich, diverse nature of the ethnic makeup of Burma, the majority rule, which democracy implies, proves to be inadequate and fell far short of what was needed to create a fair, equitable, and just political system where not simply individual rights, but group rights have to be maintained and balanced. And so the democracy movement that began in 1988, which thrusted Aung San Suu Kyi, the daughter of one of the founders of modern Burma, the martyred General Aung San, into national and later international limelight. And that democracy movement in 1988 was preceded by different waves of democratic struggles, both peaceful, above ground, in the form of mass protests, hunger strikes, agitation, as well as armed underground in the form of Burmese communist uprisings or armed movement, and non-dominant ethnic groups' armed revolutions to seek autonomy, or how they would put it, as they would put it, self-determination. And so the second part I want to talk about, after the transcendental or culturally transcendental nature of a people's desire to self-govern, which is essentially the essence of a democratic system, is the context. As you know, when students and labor activists and clergy in Gwangju rose up against one-party military rule of General Chun Do-won, the United States was very much opposed to that uprising, branding the South Korean activists as essentially communists and troublemakers, and never as Democrats who demanded equal rights and equal say in the country's affair. So in other words, South Korean uprising began in a very hostile international geopolitical equation where major world power was against it. And Gwangju uprising inspired other, newer waves of democratic struggles within South Korea and beyond the borders of South Korea, such as the Philippines and later Burmese and other Asian country or context. And so in our case, the pre-1988 uprisings led by students, monks, communists, ethnic minorities, and others against the dictatorship of the Burmese military also began in a hostile environment of the Cold War. During the Cold War, as you know, neither Eastern Bloc nor Western powers were interested in either human rights or democratization of anyone else. The West was pursuing what was then popularly known as the containment strategy, how to contain the spread of quote-unquote communist contagion, essentially, to use today's pandemic language. So the Burmese military cleverly presented itself as a neutral party that was fighting against the Burmese communists. Because the Burmese military, our dictators, succeeded in painting themselves to Washington and London and other Western powers as anti-communist dictators, they were tolerated. And the CIA was training the Burmese military intelligence. Even the U.S. administration of Jimmy Carter, or Mr. Human Rights, were pumping hundreds of millions of U.S. dollars in the form of anti-narcotic aid into the coffers of the Burmese military. So then came 1988, and there were signs of Eastern Bloc collapsing, or at least being seriously weakened. And sure enough, by November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and all of a sudden, the life of the Soviet Russia, USSR, was no longer sustainable. And from the fall of Berlin Wall in November 1989 onward, the United States and Western powers began to raise issues of human rights violations by the very governments led by military, which they supported for nearly 3 decades. So it was against that background the Burmese democracy movement gained international momentum. And the military held elections in 1989, a year after they crushed the student-led and later nationwide uprising. And the elections were won by Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy party in a landslide. When the democratic opposition won the military-sponsored elections, the Burmese military decided to nullify the outcome of that elections. In a few months leading up to the elections in 1989, the New York Times ran an article with the title, "Elections Will Change Nothing." That was in 1989 May, I believe. And today, that conclusion, elections in Burma change nothing, remains valid. 31 years after the elections were held, Burma remained fundamentally a military rule and military controlled political system with the veneer of democratic government. And the government has no real power to actually push through fundamental reforms beyond cosmetic changes. And so the third point I wish to bring up is the absence of the internalization of the ethos or values of human rights within our Burmese democratic movement. As you know, Aung San Suu Kyi went on to win Nobel Peace Prize in 1991 for her nonviolent struggles against Burmese military dictatorship. By now, it became abundantly clear that opposing one's own oppression does not necessarily translate into embracing or promoting or internalization of the rights of humans as equals, irrespective of their legal citizenship status or immigration status or social status. It is rather tragic, therefore, that the Burmese democracy movement that was once held worldwide as a beacon of hope for different societies struggling under various forms of authoritarian rules, today came to be identified closely with majoritarian genocidal policies of Burma. And this past January, the once iconic figure of liberal democracy, human rights, and nonviolence, namely Aung San Suu Kyi herself, appeared before the International Court of Justice as Myanmar's official representative or agent, collaborating with her former captors, the Burmese military, and denying and dismissing the credible allegations that our country, Burma, led by the Burmese military, supported by Buddhist Sangha, and again backed by Aung San Suu Kyi herself, is committing or commissioning the heinous crime of genocide against Rohingya people. So today, 32 years after our nationwide uprising in the month of August 1988, we no longer have a credible citizens' movement for human rights or democratization. All dissidents now, that began their political activism as university students or high school students in their teens and late teens and early 20s. Now we are in our mid 50s or, some of us even approaching 60s. Majority of Burmese dissidents of that era, 88 generation era, now support the country's military, adopt the language of national security, and clamor for the essentially genocidal expulsion of Rohingya Muslims. So you see, when a democratic struggle lacks the internalized value system that embraces self-governance, that embraces human rights, that embraces compassion, Buddhist compassion, we end up in this space where the entire country stands credibly accused of being genocidal. So that is, a major lesson that may be shared with the wider, dissidents and activists around the world. Simply because we are opposed to those who oppress us, the political systems that oppress us, do not make us champions of freedom or champions of democracy or champions of human rights until and unless we are prepared to stand up for those most vulnerable, weakest, and in Frantz Fanon's term, the wretched of the weak. I thank the Seoul Metropolitan Government and the May 18th 40th Anniversary Organizing Commission for asking me to share my thoughts on Burmese democratic struggle. And my final thought is that democratic struggles or human rights struggles, they are not NGO work. And I began as an activist in 1988 at the age of 24, and I am now 56 going into 57. And this is a lifetime struggle. And for many that came before me, this is an intergenerational struggle. And we still have not seen light at the end of the tunnel. But looking back, all these 30 years, I have absolutely no regret that despite the fact that we have not accomplished what we set out to accomplish, which is to democratize the Burmese political system, to push for federated form of state that will accommodate the aspirations of non-dominant ethnic people. And finally, to create a system where every human, irrespective of their legal status within the territories of Burma, will enjoy equal protection before law. And I wish the conference a success, and I hope to be back in Seoul post-pandemic. Thank you very much.